Good morning. I'm the Reverend Dr. David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. I want to welcome you to our assembly today. I know that many of you in Minneapolis have had very little sleep, maybe because you were on a neighborhood watch for much of the evening, maybe because the helicopters have been flying over all night, or just worried or overdosed on news that we all are consuming a little too much of. We want to try to calm us all down this morning here in Minneapolis. A Washington Post article, speaking of news overload, today reads like this: buildings burn, Trump talks tough, where are the healers? And I want to say, we're here. We are the Unitarian Universalist Humanists, and we are here to help heal and think through these problems that we're having today. Stay in touch with us. We are on Facebook, we are on Twitter, we are on Instagram. Our website is www.firstunitarian.org, or you can call or email. We want to be here for each other and support each other in this very difficult time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care of yourself. Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of congregational humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. I'm David Breeden, Senior Minister. Welcome.
Good morning, and welcome to the online Sunday Assembly of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis for May 31st, 2020. I'm the Reverend Kelly Clement, one of the assistant ministers here at FUS. I'm joined online today by the Reverend Dr. David Breeden, Senior Minister, the Reverend Jim Foti, Assistant Minister, Allison Wyeth, our Director of Religious Education, several talented musicians who are sharing their work with us, and a remarkable tech team who is making this possible for all of us and all of you. Especially in these tender and traumatic days, thank you for making the effort to be present with us from wherever you are. First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. We are an intentionally and radically inclusive congregational humanist community dedicated to promoting a brave, free, and responsible search for purpose, meaning, and justice. Our theme for the month of May is Thresholds. You know by now that our building is closed, and this gathered congregation is one of the open heart, the open mind, and the open hand. Please be sure to carefully read the Friday email and the monthly newsletter coming out this week to find information about ways to connect and what's happening at FUS. These are our primary avenues of communication. If it's happening related to FUS, you will find it in the Friday email or the monthly newsletter. If you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at our website, www.firstunitarian.org. You'll find the sign-up link at the bottom of our homepage. While you're on our website, you can find lots of other great information about the Society, ways to connect, contact information for our ministers and staff, and a way to donate to our work in the world. During assembly today, please be sure and take a glance at the chat windows that accompany the video streams. We'll be posting some resources there. Feel free to comment on what you hear. Here's one tech note. If your audio and visual feed get out of sync, just refresh your page. That often does the trick. After assembly today, we invite you to join our coffee hour, our online coffee hour. Rev Jim will be hosting this time, which usually lasts about half an hour. The Zoom link will be shared in our chat stream today. You can come and go as you wish. We'll have some breakout rooms and some questions to get the conversation started. On Monday evening of this week, tomorrow night, June 1st at 6 p.m., I will be hosting a Zoom space where we can gather, share our rage, grief, confusion, and some action steps that we can take in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent uprising in the Twin Cities. You can find the Zoom link in the Friday email, and that will be shared in the chat today also. Even as some other parts of our community are opening up, First Unitarian Society will maintain an online-only presence for many months to come. Thank you again for joining us.
Good morning. I'm Allison Wyeth, Director of Religious Education for First Unitarian Society. It's good to see you this morning. I'm here to give you the update for what's coming up for our RE program now that we're back from our short break. We have quite a bit going on, so bear with me. Parents, our parent gathering returns on Tuesday at 6 p.m., where we'll check in, get and give some support, and share ideas for keeping our kids busy in the upcoming summer months. On Thursday at 4 p.m., our senior high gathering group will meet, enjoy some fellowship time, and then play some collaborative online games. It should be a pretty good time. Friday at 10:30, our K through 5th Cocoa Half Hour will meet. We'll check in with each other and then spend some time thinking about how we might support those of us at FUS who could use a little mood boost right now. Kids, you'll want to bring some paper and something to draw with, I think. And finally, at noon on Friday, our middle school gathering group will meet, check in with each other, and try out some of our collaborative online games. I hope you're all well, and I'll see you again soon.
First Unitarian Society is an independent, democratically governed congregation that depends upon you for its existence. In this time of trouble, we are the voice of Unitarian Universalist humanism. Please help us to stay loud and strong. You can give on the Give Plus app and download that on your smartphone, or to giveplus.com, or you can go to our website, www.firstunitarian.org. Thank you.
Each week when we gather, we light our chalice and share one of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, or one of the aspirations of our congregation. This week we light the chalice remembering the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person.
If you will repeat with me, please, our congregational covenant. Love is the spirit of this place, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Each week when we gather, we take a few moments to reflect on the joys and the sorrows of the human experience. This has been a week of headlines and history and fear, but let's step back a moment and remember the human cost of the recent events. We want to keep George Floyd and his family in our thoughts. Let's take a moment of silence. Another sorrow this week is we lost a member of the FUS family, Cirillo Hernandez. Cirillo had worked for FUS as a building steward since 1991. He went back to Guatemala in 2018 to take care of his ill father. We very much hoped that he would return someday and to FUS, but that is not to be. He succumbed to complications from COVID-19. Cirillo's life was complex. He, as a young man, was part of a land clearance program that drove indigenous farmers from their land in Guatemala, in the highlands. He was one of over 50,000 Guatemalan refugees who walked over 1,000 miles from Guatemala to Mexico City, and then he was able to get into the United States and come here just in time for the blizzard in 1991. But he became so much a part of our family, and we will miss Cirillo so much. We keep Antelmo Paxtor, his nephew, in our thoughts and the family. And thank you all for the messages that you have sent in memory of Cirillo. Let's take a moment of silence now.
This is Gabriel's oboe from the wonderful film, The Mission. And this is really a plea for peace of all people by Morricone.
At first glance, the pictures seem like something from San Francisco in 1906, or Germany in 1943. In one photo, the remains of a brick building loom above the street, nothing left except one defiant corner that somehow survived the onslaught. In other photos, there are collapsed roofs with dark smoke arcing across the clear sky, and trees with leaves incinerated. But these aren't black and white pictures from long ago. They're in full color, and they're from right here in Minnesota. A week ago today, every one of those buildings was intact. A week ago today, George Floyd was alive among us. Unlike in San Francisco, we didn't have an actual earthquake, and unlike Germany, we were not bombed in a declared war. But our community has been through something as jolting as an earthquake, and we're seeing catastrophic effects of the tactics of war. As a result, those of us who live here are experiencing some of the fear, trauma, and anger that can come from such events. And the pandemic had already heightened such emotions. And we're wondering, after many unnerving and dangerous nights, what comes next? Our Sunday morning theme this month here at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is thresholds, those times when there's a before and an after and no going back. Before this past week, the whole of humanity was already going through a huge and disruptive transition from the pre-coronavirus world to one with COVID-19. Daily life suddenly became filled with staggering death tolls and frightening economic dislocation. And now all of us have been catapulted through another before and after, the execution of George Floyd. Both of these transitions are marked by profound grief, anger over misused power, gross racial injustices, and vast uncertainty. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill, we're not even at the end of the beginning of either situation. Trauma is being experienced very differently among different levels of privilege, but there is still trauma all around. That trauma, along with all the other emotions, can make it hard to process what has happened or think about what might come next. Even the best informed people can't predict where things will go, either in the fight against white supremacy culture or the destructive trajectory of the coronavirus. To get through this time and look ahead, it can be helpful to acknowledge the heavy grief you may be carrying. Lamentation can be an important practice, to name and acknowledge losses that are beyond our control. It takes humility to accept that we may need to grieve and lament. It takes humility to acknowledge that there will always be things that we didn't know, or that we've been told but haven't fully heard. It takes humility to listen as we try to determine what's next. So I want to talk today about what we have seen this week, what many of us have relearned or newly learned, and what many already knew. And though we are still in the middle of much chaos and uncertainty, I want to talk about what might happen next and how we might make it happen. First, I want to start with a short visit to my own past. In my family, when I was growing up, we watched the evening news while we were eating dinner. Some families talk during mealtime, but my family talked plenty already, so dinner time was when we turned our attention outward, beyond our home in Milwaukee's very white suburbs. The slogan of the local station we watched was, "Your window to the world." And in a way it was. I grew up very well informed about current events, and I still remember much of what I took in. This week, our Minneapolis earthquake shook forth from my memory the story of Ernest Lacey. I was 12 years old when his name first appeared on our TV, and I can still see in my mind the one photograph his family must have had of him. One hot summer night, 3 Milwaukee police officers decided that Ernest fit the vague description of an African-American rape suspect they were looking for. They grabbed Ernest, pinned him face down, with an officer's knee between his shoulder blades, and his left cheek pressed hard against the ground. Ernest stopped breathing, and his body beaten and bruised, he died in the police van. He was 22 years old. A week later, the 3 officers were exonerated by an internal investigation, and the long work for justice began. Ernest Lacey wasn't the only name we heard at our dinner table. I also learned about Daniel Bell, also 22, also African American. Daniel was shot to death by Milwaukee police during a traffic stop back in the 1950s. The officers cited self-defense and were believed. Daniel Bell's name reappeared in the news in 1979 when one of the officers from the traffic stop confessed to planting a knife in the right hand of Daniel's body. I mention these stories from decades past to remind us that the news this week, as fresh and raw as some of it feels, is not new. Most white people have been told, one way or another, that African Americans are regularly killed by police, and they've been told for a very long time. But being told and hearing what is being said are two different things. I'm reminded of a quote by the Indian author Arundhati Roy. "There's really no such thing as the voiceless," she says. "There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." The main difference between these older cases in the past week was that the video made it impossible for police to silence George Floyd in his last minutes. Witnesses to police brutality used to be few to none, but now the whole world is bearing witness. And in the aftermath, our city has faced both the towering flames of arson and the harsh spotlight of scrutiny. Anybody who knows me knows I love Minneapolis and Minnesota and have long felt fortunate to live and serve here. I don't love it any less after this week, but I'm reminded of this quote by the brilliant African-American writer James Baldwin. He said this, "I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." We here in our local community have seen both our strengths and our tremendous vulnerabilities on international display. Blunt assessments are well underway. In a post called When the City I Love Burns, former Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Ryback didn't hold back about Minnesota's unjust systems of law enforcement. Quote, "We need to acknowledge that on some level, every one of us had a role in keeping this inequity in place. I'll go first because after 12 years as mayor of this city, I should. My own efforts to change a police department and its culture failed badly. That will haunt me for the rest of my life, and it should." On the national level, David Vondrelli of the Washington Post asks us many questions about accountability. "It's not enough," he says, "for Minneapolis to fire the four or even to prosecute them. The entire department needs to ask why these individuals fit into its culture. Why did Officer Derek Chauvin think he could be filmed crushing the life out of a man without consequence? Why did three fellow officers think that they'd be better off letting Chauvin do it than if they stopped him? That's one sick brotherhood of the badge. And Minneapolis needs to ask why this department was ever acceptable to the community. Relationships between police and citizens of color have been bad for years. This isn't the first death, and these aren't the first protests. Yet only 1 in every 100 citizens' complaints leads to disciplinary action. Why have voters tolerated that? Why indeed? Ellie Mistel is an African-American lawyer in New York. Writing in The Nation, Mistel was even more pointed, noticing that, quote, "White people will participate in the outrage over specific murders, but when it comes time to deal with the institutional purveyors of racism, as opposed to individual bad actors, the outrage and support of the white community is not there." Since moving here nearly 30 years ago, I've known that our police department was violently corrupt. I came here at a time when Native Americans were transported in the trunk of a police car, and when a single officer could rack up millions of dollars in brutality settlements and still keep his job and pension. None of that has really changed. Why the white majority has tolerated it is a fair and sobering question. I've learned to look at our city in new ways this week. I'm newly aware of its fragility and reminded of its resilience and diverse lives. I read a post by Filiberto Nolasco Gomez, who walked through some of the devastation, with its torch stores and graffiti-tagged walls. As he was doing so, he writes, "It occurred to me that all the tags and burnt-out buildings better reflect what a lot of us are feeling, rather than the pristine, sterile aisles in what was Target." In other words, The chaos and mess more closely represented his lived experience in the city. Looking upon the detritus of all that rage, he says, "I felt seen and heard." While meditating on the scene, Filiberto sees a couple of white joggers coming through, going about their normal lives. I've talked about this before, how white people tend to go about their day while all manner of tragedies befall the rest of the country. This is happening with the pandemic, too. Shortly after the joggers pass, Filiberto sees a white TV crew using as its backdrop the most cliched of low-income images, a liquor store with bars on the windows. Filiberto writes, "I felt the weight of the responsibility that comes with being a journalist of color in the face of my colleagues who actively choose to reinforce stereotypes instead of helping people understand the wider perspective." One of the stereotypes that Minneapolis has had to push back against this week is the idea that low-income people of color like to burn down their own neighborhoods. Why are they doing such a thing? Certain white people ask. The answer, of course, is they aren't. This I already knew because I know some of the leaders of the Black Lives Movement, and I'm familiar with their principles, tactics, and strategies. Destroying grocery stores and post offices and black-owned barber shops that serve large numbers of people of color is not part of any organized plan for dismantling white supremacy culture. However, in the twisted logic of the white supremacy movement, such establishments are worthy of destruction because they are symbols of government or symbols of African American success. That's what most of the burning has been about. Not rage, but creating chaos. Heather Cox Richardson is a history professor who has a large Facebook following and who is on watch against authoritarianism. And she reminds us this. This chaotic onslaught of news is designed to divide Americans and make us fall back into old animosities in order to either get us to accept a strong leader or to exhaust us until we quit caring what happens. In either case, American democracy is over. But there is another possibility, she writes. Chaos does not have to destroy us. The leaders creating it are doing so precisely because they know they are not in control. And the same uncertainty that they are trying to leverage can just as easily be used by their opponents. At this crazy, frightening, chaotic moment, it is possible to reach across old lines and create new alliances. To reemphasize that most Americans really do share the same values of economic fairness and equality before the law, and to rebuild the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The old world is certainly dying, she says, but the shape of the new world struggling to be born is not yet determined. And that's where you come in, where we come in. I think the George Floyd video has confirmed for the remaining persuadable people that policing problems are real and dire and ongoing. The protests, the largely peaceful demonstrations, have been multiracial and beautiful. The people working to clean up damage have been multiracial and beautiful. The caring, coexisting, coming together Minneapolis is not a myth, and we can be grateful for it at the same time that we acknowledge all that is deeply wrong. We would also be wise to listen to the words of Bayard Rustin, a gay African-American civil rights activist and pacifist who was a close associate of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Rustin said, "I believe in social dislocation and creative trouble." As a pacifist, Rustin of course meant nonviolent trouble, but he understood in a progressive way that times like these are times of opportunity. I've recently been on some national clergy calls organized by the Reverend Peggy Clark, who serves Community Church of New York. She also thinks this time of pandemic and uprising, is a time to act. She says this, "We have an opportunity to help define the social transformation before us. As a nation, we could become an ossified oligarchy, partial to fascism, or we could birth a new age of ecological, social, economic, and political balance. If we participate, there is a better chance the new world will be grounded in principles of equity." So what does that kind of participation look like right now? For me, I'm off to only a small start so far. But the other day I got a message from Isaiah, a large interfaith coalition of congregations pushing for racial justice. Isaiah was inviting me to sign a clergy letter calling for putting the Minneapolis Police Department into a receivership. I quickly signed. The MPD is clearly unable to manage its own affairs or its employees. The atrocity of George Floyd's death was followed immediately by unprovoked attacks on peaceful protesters, followed immediately by the department all but vanishing when the city started to burn. I believe the department to be beyond repair, and the University of Minnesota and the city's public schools have severed their ties with the department. Several community leaders I respect have endorsed the idea of abolishing the police and reallocating resources to social workers, conflict mediators, and mental health professionals. If you have a New York Times subscription, check out a new essay called "No More Money for the Police." I was also interested to learn about the dissolution and reconstitution of a police force in Northern Ireland. Some officers were kept, and some were not. Our city's lethally flawed, widely distrusted department might be a good candidate for exploring some of these concepts. Another way to participate in change right now is to work on economic issues. The same voters who have tolerated unequal treatment by police for so long have tolerated the often deadly differences in healthcare access, sick leave, and basic wages. Like police brutality, brutal differences in life expectancy by demographics and zip code have been visible to anyone paying attention, and horrible for millions of Americans. The pandemic threw a big magnifying glass on our country's pre-existing conditions, ending some deliberate silencing of the marginalized and expanding the suffering well into the middle. So find your candidates in this year's elections, look through their platforms, and push them toward positions that protect people over capital, and that center the need for universal health care. Human thriving should be foremost. And finally, although we are still reeling from the destruction of the past several days, I hope you'll remember that taking to the streets in nonviolent protest to give form to grief and grievance is still an incredibly valuable tool. How much longer might it have taken for charges to be filed? Would charges even have been filed without the mass gatherings calling for justice for George Floyd? Even with the pandemic going on, I hope each of you will keep protest as a tool in your toolbox. And here's why. As many of you know, authoritarianism has infected the highest levels of our government. Authoritarians can be stopped, but the ballot box is no guarantee. Action in the streets is often required, and it may be required of us. So it's not a bad thing that Americans are having this chance to exercise their protest muscle, because there's a reasonable chance we'll need it to preserve our democracy. I want to close by going back to those pictures I talked about at the beginning. Pictures of places we loved, buildings where memories and livelihoods were made, streetscapes that were etched in our minds and oriented us in the world. Even as I have grieved the loss of our shared landscape, I have been humbled by the number of Minneapolitans who have said, "Our business will be back. George Floyd won't be. Let's focus on what's important and work for justice." We face a long road of grief and rebuilding, but let's think again of San Francisco and Germany. They rose from the ashes, were gloriously restored, and are beacons to the world. If we create a just and beautiful new Minneapolis, we can do the same.
If you will repeat with me, please, our extinguishing chalice words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. All of these we carry in our hearts and in our minds until we are together again.
Until we meet again. Be fearless. Ask questions. Hold on to what is good. Strengthen the weak. Comfort the fearful. Serve the suffering. Do what makes you come alive, because we need more people who have come alive. Rejoice in the power of the human spirit. So may it be. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism,
and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.